All right, I think we have,
Now I can hear you again. We lost our Wi-Fi or something for a minute there and we couldn't
Alright.
hear you and you were just frozen.
or further
Yes,
along?
you.
Oh, fine, okay.
For about the last 5 minutes. So
Uh,
people are coming back in now. We're almost up to speed here, but
All right,
you
I
lost your connection for a little bit there.
okay. I think we were in the middle of responding to John's comment that in that second paragraph, Lincoln was reaching out to the South and accusing the Southerners of slandering the North. We'll go back to John. Kim, were you watching at the moment we lost it? Did you capture where we were when we?
No, because at first you were just like, it was like you were getting a little garbled.
Yeah.
And then you just went frozen and I could see your face, but not hear any words. So I would say it was about 5 minutes ago.
Okay. Do we still have our people?
I
Yes,
got bumped off. I had to re-enter the virtual portal.
Okay.
It's all good now.
Judy,
There's
where were we when we?
everybody but all but 6 are back.
Okay. Judy, where were we when we lost the thread?
Probably with John speaking.
Yeah.
It started to get garbled with John, and then your response was it cut out. So if
Now
you
it's
get
happening
John to
again.
rephrase his
But
question.
yes, it was when you were responding to John.
Do you want me to repeat?
Well, John was making the point
My
that
interpretation of
Lincoln
that
is reaching out to the
paragraph,
South. Yeah, go ahead, John.
which, by the way, he did throughout his entire presidency, and including his second inaugural speech. This is very typical of Lincoln. He's also flipping the blame for polarization onto the Southern radicals, because he says in the beginning of the paragraph that the Southerners are not inferior to anybody else. So he's not delineating them as an inferior people. They're same as Northerners or anybody else, paying them a compliment. And then he's trying to separate the moderates from the radicals. You know, if you all of you believe we're snakes and outlaws and things, prove it. Where have we done such a thing? A very powerful paragraph, and pertinent today when we have so much polarization.
Yes. Very much. This is an extremely pertinent speech on the issues we're dealing with today. Throughout this middle section, he's going to show what John just said, that Lincoln believed that there were moderates in the South. In fact, he believed that the Republican Party would get some votes in the South. And he says, when we get some votes in the South, then we won't be sectional anymore, because you say that we are sectional because the Republican Party doesn't get any votes in the South. So he says, well, just wait a little bit and we'll get some votes in the South and then we won't be sectional anymore. So he's showing that he believes that there are reasonable people in the South. When he comes to write the Emancipation Proclamation, it's written in exactly the same way. It is written to appeal to the moderates in the South who would be ready to accept the deal Lincoln was offering in the Emancipation Proclamation. Not a deal to the slaves, because they had no power. It was a deal to the Southerners. And when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, he hoped that there would be a referendum to the people in each Southern state about the Emancipation Proclamation. What would you rather do? Keep your slaves, guaranteed to keep your slaves, and send a representative back to Congress and lay down your arms, or keep fighting. And if you send someone back to Congress by January 1, you will be guaranteed to keep your slaves in perpetuity. That was the deal in the Emancipation Proclamation. And he hoped that slave owner or not slave owner in the South, the people would think about that trust that Lincoln meant what he said and quit. In other words, it was a peace offer. It was an offer to stop the war. Not another shot will be fired in any state that accepts this deal. Well, there was no referendum in any state because the oligarchs that controlled those states didn't permit any referendum to the people. There was no popular sovereignty because the Emancipation Proclamation was never taken to the people in the South. It was presented to the South as just, well, Lincoln is saying again, he's going to come down here with his armies and free the slaves with blood and terror. And that's not what the Emancipation Proclamation was. Got a little off the track there, but it supports John's point and believed that further negotiation by him or appeal to the reasonableness and the common sense of the Southern people could still avoid war. But not if they wouldn't try. Then he said, there's a battle for Washington going on here too. At the bottom of 9, he says, our face is the warning against sectional parties that Washington gave in his farewell address. Less than 8 years before Washington gave that warning,
Is your mic off? Is your mic off? You're coming through garbled.
no, okay, we're still having trouble with my connection then. Oh dear. Can you hear me now?
You're going in and out.
We can
Say that Lincoln did, but you're not intending to.
All right. Well, I'll just continue talking and maybe Kim or Susan can step in.
Keeping
if we're
forward
not.
like that, you're coming through better.
Okay. All right. There's a battle for Washington
better.
going on. And Lincoln is going to show that Washington is on his side. They ended up side by side on Mount Rushmore, but Lincoln is struggling for that result here. He's saying Washington agreed with me, not with you. If you say that Washington was warning about sectionalism, and you say that we're being sectional, remember that a warning he had signed the act of Congress
Losing you
that
again.
prohibited slavery in the territory. So, okay. So, and the South is being in
out.
Linda,
baby,
Linda,
in
the
and out
video's
again.
not working.
Okay. Okay, I think we're out again.
Where's your speaker?
All right, now here's,
The
now
video's
am I
not
back
working.
on? Okay, the
Yes.
video's not
I can see
working.
you, I can hear you, but it's cuts in and out.
The only possibility I can think of, everyone, is that we're having a bandwidth issue right now in the building, which I will troubleshoot with CIT as soon as we're off.
Okay.
But I think it's a bandwidth issue. It's not, but right now I can hear you and see you, so.
All right.
Well, Linda, you want to just
I
continue?
think we were in the middle of the point that I think, well, it's 10 minutes to 11. We have time for a couple more questions and to point us toward next week. What are the main questions that you have as you get ready to read the rest of the speech and watch Sam Waterston in more detail? Waterston.
Anyone?
In the end, here's what you're going to see Lincoln do in the rest of the speech. He's going to say, not only did the 21 framers agree with the Republican position that I'm defining here, but Washington agreed with it because of this paragraph right here. And Jefferson agreed with it. And he's going to show that also all 76 members of the Congress that passed the Northwest Orient Ordinance agreed with controlling slavery in the territories. And then he goes on and says that all men of the 18th century agreed with this position. All men of the 1700s agreed with it. He says that states' rights and popular sovereignty, the way the South was explaining it, didn't get created until 1850. That's what he's saying in this speech. You guys are fresh out of nowhere with your great principle of popular sovereignty. He is attacking popular sovereignty as not being anywhere near where the forefathers positioned themselves about slavery, and claiming that the Republicans are the true conservatives. He says Republicans are the only conservatives, the only ones who are preserving the peaceful, orderly transition out of a mixed society and toward a confederacy of free states that the forefathers dreamed about. So he's building this claim from a narrow start with the 21 people and expanding it until he has claimed that everybody in the 18th century, and at that point, Waterston's audience laughs because they've seen him make this grand gesture of claiming that the Republicans and only the Republicans have set up a truly conservative and wise and charitable and reasonable plan for the Union based on law and order, and not the chaos of states' rights with no federal power at all. By the end of the war, I think it's interesting to notice that the Civil War was not ended by Jefferson Davis. Why not? Well, Jefferson Davis never ended the war until he was captured and had to surrender as a prisoner of war. So Jefferson Davis, representing the Confederacy, never signed anything or agreed to anything that ended the war. So how did the war end? Well, we all know that Lee signed a surrender at Appomattox, and that is considered in the history books the end of the Civil War. But who did Lee actually resign? Who did Lee surrender for? Only his own army. Only his own army. There was another army controlled by Johnston that hears a few days or a week later that Lee surrendered, but Johnston has to carry out a whole separate surrender. So there's a whole new procedure in where Johnston was fighting for him to surrender his troops. And then there were other small groups of Confederate fighters still fighting in other places. In other words, if you go to the ultimate states' rights, any state that starts shooting can start a war, but there is no means for the states as a body to end a war. You ultimately have states that don't have enough of a confederation to have any federal power able to form a treaty altogether or start, but they can't stop a war. And so the raggedy, uneven ending of the Civil War is another chapter in our history that shows that without federal power, you don't have a nation. Without enough federal power, that, as Lincoln was trying to define it, it's difficult to form any nation. Lincoln believes in Congress. Lincoln believes in the concept of Congress and the means that the Constitution had laid out for declaring war, for controlling for slavery, for ending war, for deciding how the business of the government will be carried out, for treaties and agreements. And he ultimately freed the slaves as an act of war, but he believed and says in this speech that the Congress does not have the power to emancipate the slaves in the slave states. He says that clearly in this speech. Therefore, when it came time for the Emancipation Proclamation, it was in order to deprive the South of the means of making further war. Are there any other questions? By the bottom of page 12, Sam Waterston will be at a very high pitch. And I encourage you to look at the way that Waterston portrays the slow, amazing build of this speech that takes place in the latter half. So make yourself a cup of coffee, settle in for the long haul of the rest of this speech, and listen to the whole thing and try and get the sweep of it.
All right, well, we have about 2 minutes left. Are there any more questions?
Let's talk about John Brown for a second here.
Yeah.
I like what Lincoln said about Brown, the bottom of page 2, in which he points out that John Brown is not a Republican. He's essentially an anarchist. Well, this is a man who ultimately sought and embraced martyrdom, but he was an anarchist. Again, I see a parallel today.
Yeah.
With the
John, you meant
Black
page,
Lives Matter movement is one thing, but violence by other people, and as Candy Biden has pointed out, those are not protesters, they're anarchists.
Yeah.
Ones that are burning and looting and shooting, those are anarchists. There's a difference between the two. And Lincoln makes that distinction right here with John Brown. Again, relevant to today.
you misspoke when you said page 2. I think you meant
I
page
said 12, I meant 10,
Yeah.
page 10, I'm sorry.
He has wonderful discussion of John Brown right there in about 2 paragraphs. And of course, that was very recent at that time. That was late in 1859 that happened. When he works up ahead of steam on page 13, I think that he is now calling those who promote states' rights to the point of war reckless. Top of page 13, that has a somewhat reckless sound. But it would be palliated or soothed, if not fully justified, were we proposing by the means of force of numbers to deprive you of some right plainly written down in the Constitution, but we are proposing no such thing. Again and again, he's trying to correct the opposition's understanding of what Lincoln is doing, all of which is consistent with the Constitution, not all out war where we're going to come down there and have our way and you're going to have to fight us off. He then discusses the other thing that we might touch on here is the Dred Scott decision, which he touches on next. The Supreme Court had made the Dred Scott decision, which had the equivalent, it's the way we look on Roe v. Wade as being a turning point, a very signal decision by the Supreme Court that had a tremendous effect. Well, the Dred Scott decision was looked upon the same way with respect to slavery at that time. And so he's going to discuss that Dred Scott decision and saying that the judges claimed that the right of property in a slave is clear in the Constitution, and Lincoln is saying, no, it's not. Lincoln is claiming that there is no expressed or explicit connection in the Constitution of the slave as property. And this is still a confusing point that is sometimes, assumed that the Constitution does treat slaves as property. And Lincoln is saying, no, it does not technically. The judges do not pledge their judicial opinion that such right is impliedly affirmed in the Constitution, but they pledge, and on their veracity, that is distinctly and expressly affirmed there, distinctly. And he's saying that is a mistake of fact. So he's saying the judges need to realize that they made an error of fact, and therefore the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court is wrong and should be overturned. Lincoln seems to think that they will voluntarily overturn it when this fact is pointed out to them. Well, good luck with that. But he does make the case that he personally thinks the Dred Scott decision was dreadful for the cause of anti-slavery and a wrong decision by the Supreme Court. He doesn't promote striking down the Supreme Court though, or defying the Supreme Court. His remedy is to call the Supreme Court to a new review. Now, in this section where he says, what could we do that would pacify the South? He goes through a number of proposals and shows that everything that could be done to pacify the South is completely impossible. He is saying in the last section, I think, do you agree, John, and those of other of you who have spoken, that Lincoln is coming out with the feeling that it's almost too late for the process of debate and negotiation to have any possibility of avoiding war. In other words, I mean, he will be at war 1 year from now. So he is not blind to the fact that the South has worked itself up into a frenzy based on a number of caricatures and poisoning the well for the Republican Party. And that could come true, that there will be no pathway to peace that Lincoln can see. And a year from March, or let's see, in late March and early April is when the first shot was fired at Sumter in 1861. So that opened the war. And the decision to defend Sumter was, as Lincoln always described it, the most difficult decision up to that time in his life, to decide what to do when he came. By the time he walked into office, 2 or 3 states had already seceded. So the day had passed. The worst fears were being realized in the secession of some states before they even gave Lincoln a chance to further express or show what he would have done as president if the Union had still been together when he took office, which it wasn't.
Okay, well, it's 11:05. Is this a good time to maybe wrap and then set up the next class?
All right, so for the next class, you'll read the rest of the oration. Next time we'll wrap up. We'll please, any questions that occur to you along the way about the background of this speech, we can take that into consideration. And I hope that this famous speech, which is now part of our history and one that is more and more gaining recognition as perhaps Lincoln's greatest speech in the way it was able to be understood by its audience at the time by unifying the North. If Lincoln had not been able to unify the Republican Party, it's impossible to tell what would have happened. It's impossible to know what would have happened if the Republican Party had not been able to pull together a platform that had both Eastern support and Western support along the entire band of Northern states. When the Civil War broke out, there were 22 million people in the Union and only 9 million in the South, which included about 4 million slaves. So there were only about 5 million whites in the South undertaking the war for the Confederacy against 22 million in the North. So those numbers tell us a great deal. But between this speech and that final tally of who's on the field as the Civil War starts, a lot was still to happen in that last year before the war. Thank you, Steve, for coordinating. I'm sorry we had some glitches here. Kim and Susan, I'm right here in the virtual classroom, so I don't think it's my...
No, the only thing I can troubleshoot is that it's a bandwidth issue here in the building. So as soon as we get off, I'll call CIT and troubleshoot that, since we have another even larger class this afternoon. But thanks to all of you for hanging in there. I appreciate it, and I will certainly follow up with it. I do have one request that I should have mentioned at the beginning. But for those of you who are still here, if you are on an iPad, phone, or your computer, and in some cases your identity only says a telephone number or maybe just your first name, That will be difficult for us as hosts to know whether or not you're registered and whether or not to admit you into the virtual classroom. So if you're able to change that, the way that you do that is by clicking on participants, and then you hover by your name. And there's two blue boxes. One says mute and one says more. If you click on more, you should see fourth option down is rename. If you could type in your either first initial and last name or first and last name, that's really helpful for us to better be able to identify you as you sign in. So if you have any questions about that, give us a call here on a Tuesday or Thursday at the office, or email us and we'll try to walk you through it. But this week, since it's our first week of classes, we're being a little more loose with who we're letting in if we don't recognize it right away. But then we're gonna have to crack down a little bit more so that our registrants are the only ones admitted to the classroom. So call us if you have questions, but thanks for that. And thanks for being here. And I know I'll see a lot of you this afternoon for Supreme Court. So we'll see you then. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
And thank you, Steve.
You bet. Thanks.